Chapter 11 of Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11 The Cottagers.
As I had now only one regular pupil, though she contrived to give me as much trouble as 3 or 4 ordinary ones, and though her sister still took lessons in German and drawing, I had considerably more time at my own disposal than I had ever been blessed with before, since I had taken upon me the governess's yoke, which time I devoted partly to correspondence with my friends, partly to reading, study, and the practice of music, singing, etc., partly to wandering in the grounds or adjacent fields, with my pupils if they wanted me, alone if they did not. Often, when they had no more agreeable occupation at hand, the Misses Murray would amuse themselves with visiting the poor cottagers on their father's estate, to receive their flattering homage, or to hear the old stories or gossiping news of the garrulous old women, or, perhaps, to enjoy the purer pleasure of making the poor people happy with their cheering presence and their occasional gifts, so easily bestowed, so thankfully received. Sometimes I was called upon to accompany one or both of the sisters in these visits, and sometimes I was desired to go alone, to fulfil some promise which they had been more ready to make than to perform, to carry some small donation, or read to one who was sick or seriously disposed. And thus I made a few acquaintances among the cottagers, and occasionally I went to see them on my own account. I generally had more satisfaction in going alone than with either of the young ladies, for they, chiefly owing to their defective education, comported themselves towards their inferiors in a manner that was highly disagreeable for me to witness. They never, in thought, exchanged places with them, and consequently had no consideration for their feelings, regarding them as an order of beings entirely different from themselves. They would watch the poor creatures at their meals, making uncivil remarks about their food, and their manner of eating. They would laugh at their simple notions and provincial expressions, till some of them scarcely durst venture to speak. They would call the grave elderly men and women old fools and silly old blockheads to their faces, and all this without meaning to offend. I could see that the people were often hurt and annoyed by such conduct, though their fear of the grand ladies prevented them from testifying any resentment, but they never perceived it. They thought that, as these cottagers were poor and untaught, they must be stupid and brutish; and as long as they, their superiors, condescended to talk to them, and to give them shillings and half-crowns, or articles of clothing, they had a right to amuse themselves, even at their expense, and the people must adore them as angels of light, condescending to minister to their necessities, and enlighten their humble dwellings. I made many and various attempts to deliver my pupils from these delusive notions, without alarming their pride, which was easily offended and not soon appeased, but with little apparent result, and I know not which was the more reprehensible of the two. Matilda was more rude and boisterous, but from Rosalie's womanly age and ladylike exterior better things were expected, yet she was as provokingly careless and inconsiderate as a giddy child of 12. One bright day in the last week of February, I was walking in the park, enjoying the threefold luxury of solitude, a book, and pleasant weather. For Miss Matilda had set out on her daily ride, and Miss Murray was gone in the carriage with her mamma to pay some morning calls. But it struck me that I ought to leave these selfish pleasures, and the park with its glorious canopy of bright blue sky, the west wind sounding through its yet leafless branches, the snow wreaths still lingering in its hollows, but melting fast beneath the sun, and the graceful deer browsing on its moist herbage, already assuming the freshness and verdure of spring, and go to the cottage of one Nancy Brown, a widow, whose son was at work all day in the fields, and who was afflicted with an inflammation in the eyes, which had for some time incapacitated her from reading, to her own great grief, for she was a woman of a serious, thoughtful turn of mind. I accordingly went, and found her alone, as usual, in her little close dark cottage, redolent of smoke and confined air, but as tidy and clean as she could make it. She was seated beside her little fire, consisting of a few red cinders and a bit of stick, busily knitting, with a small sackcloth cushion at her feet, placed for the accommodation of her gentle friend the cat, who was seated thereon, with her long tail half encircling her velvet paws, and her half-closed eyes dreamily gazing on the low crooked fender. "Well, Nancy, how are you to-day?"
"Why, middlin', miss, in myself. My eyes is no better, but I'm a deal easier in my mind, nor I have been,"
replied she, rising to welcome me with a contented smile, which I was glad to see, for Nancy had been somewhat afflicted with religious melancholy. I congratulated her upon the change. She agreed that it was a great blessing, and expressed herself
"right down thankful for it,"
adding,
If it please God to spare my sight, and make me so as I can read my Bible again, I think I shall be as happy as a queen."
"I hope he will, Nancy," replied I, "and meantime I'll come and read to you now and then, when I have a little time to spare." With expressions of grateful pleasure, the poor woman moved to get me a chair, but, as I saved her the trouble, she busied herself with stirring the fire, and adding a few more sticks to the decaying embers, and then, taking her well-used Bible from the shelf, dusted it carefully, and gave it me. On my asking if there was any particular part she should like me to read, she answered,
"Well, Miss Grey, if it's all the same to you, I should like to hear that chapter in the first epistle of St. John, that says God is love, and he that dwelleth in love dwelleth in God, and God in him."
With a little searching, I found these words in the 4th chapter. When I came to the 7th verse, she interrupted me, and with needless apologies for such a liberty, desired me to read it very slowly, that she might take it all in, and dwell on every word, hoping I would excuse her, as she was but a simple body. "The wisest person," I replied, "might think over each of these verses for an hour, and be all the better for it, and I would rather read them slowly than not." Accordingly, I finished the chapter as slowly as need be, and at the same time as impressively as I could. My auditor listened most attentively all the while, and sincerely thanked me when I had done. I sat still about half a minute to give her time to reflect upon it, when, somewhat to my surprise, she broke the pause by asking me how I liked Mr. Weston. "I don't know," I replied, a little startled by the suddenness of the question. "I think he preaches very well."
"Aye, he does so, and talks well too."
"Does he?"
"He does. Maybe you haven't seen him, nor to talk to him much yet?"
"No, I never see anyone to talk to, except the young ladies of the hall."
"Ah, they're nice, kind young ladies, but they can't talk as he does."
"Then he comes to see you, Nancy?"
"He does, miss, and I's thankful for it. He comes to see all us poor bodies a deal oftener nor Master Bligh nor the rector ever did, and it's as well he does, for he's always welcome. We can't say as much for the rector. There is that says they're fair feared on him. When he comes into a house they say he's sure to find summat wrong, and begin a calling them as soon as he crosses the doorstones, but maybe he thinks it his duty like to tell 'em what's wrong. And very oft he comes a purpose to reprove folk for not coming to church, or not kneeling and standing when the other folk does, or going to the Methody chapel, or summat of that sort. But I can't say as he ever found much fault with me. He came to see me once or twice afore Maister Weston come, when I was so ill troubled in my mind, and as I had only very poor health besides, I made bold to send for him, and he came right enough. I was sore distressed, Miss Grey. Thank God it's over now. But when I took my Bible I could get no comfort of it at all. That very chapter you've just been reading troubled me as much as aught. He that loveth not knoweth not God. It seemed fearsome to me, for I felt that I loved neither God nor man as I should do, and could not if ever I tried so. And the chapter afore, where it says, He that is born of God cannot commit sin, and another place where it says, Love is the fulfilling of the law, and many, many others, miss. I should fair weary you out if I was to tell them all. But all seemed to condemn me, and to show me that I was not in the right way, and I knew not how to get into it. I sent our Bill to beg Master Hatfield to be as kind as to look in on me some day, and when he came I telled him all my troubles.
"And what did he say, Nancy?"
"Why, miss, he seemed to scorn me. I might be mistaken, but he like gave a sort of a whistle, and I saw a bit of a smile on his face, and he said,
"Oh, it's all stuff. You've been among the Methodists, my good woman."
But I telled him I'd never been near the Methodies, and then he said,
"Well,"
says he,
"you must come to church where you hear the Scriptures properly explained, instead of sitting poring over your Bible at home."
But I telled him I always used to coming to church, when I had my health. But this very cold winter weather I hardly durst venture so far, and me so bad with the rheumatic and all. But he says,
"It'll do your rheumatiz good to hobble to church. There's nothing like exercise for the rheumatiz. You can walk about the house well enough. Why can't you walk to church? The fact is,"
says he,
"you're getting too fond of your ease. It's always easy to find excuses for shirking one's duty."
But then you know, Miss Grey, it wasn't so. However, I telled him I'd try. "But please, sir," says I, "if I do go to church, what the better shall I be? I want to have my sins blotted out, and to feel that they are remembered no more against me, and that the love of God is shed abroad in my heart. And if I can get no good by reading my Bible and saying my prayers at home, what good shall I get by going to church?"
"The church,"
says he,
"is the place appointed by God for his worship. It's your duty to go there as often as you can. If you want comfort, you must seek it in the path of duty."
and a deal more he said, but I cannot remember all his fine words. However, it all came to this, that I was to come to church as oft as ever I could, and bring my prayer book with me, and read up all the sponsors after the clerk, and stand, and kneel, and sit, and do all as I should, and take the Lord's Supper at every opportunity, and hearken to his sermons, and Master Bly's, and it'd be all right. If I went on doing my duty, I should get a blessing at last.
But if you get no comfort that way,
says he,
it's all up.
Then, sir, says I, should you think I'm a reprobate?
Why,
says he says,
if you do your best to get to heaven and can't manage it, you must be one of those that seek to enter at the strait gate, and shall not be able.
And then he asked me if I'd seen any of the ladies at the hall about that morning, so I telled him where I'd seen the young missus go on the Moss Lane, and he kicked my poor cat right across the floor, and went after him as gay as a lark. But I was very sad. That last word of his fair sunk into my heart, and lay there like a lump of lead till I was weary to bear it. Howsoever, I followed his advice. I thought he meant all for the best, though he had a queer way with him. But you know, miss, he's rich and young, and such like cannot right understand the thoughts of a poor old woman such as me. But, howsoever, I did my best to do all as he bade me. But maybe I'm plaguing you, miss, with my chatter.
Oh, no, Nancy. Go on and tell me all.
Well, my rheumatiz got better. I know not whether we're going to church or not, but one frosty Sunday I got this cold in my eyes. The inflammation didn't come on all at once like, but bit by bit. But I wasn't going to tell you about my eyes. I was talking about my trouble of mind. And to tell the truth, Miss Grey, I don't think it was any ways eased by coming to church. Not to speak on, at least. I got my health better, but that didn't mend my soul. I hearkened and hearkened the ministers, and read at my prayer book, but it was all like sounding brass in a tinkling cymbal. The sermons I couldn't understand, and the prayer book only served to show me how wicked I was, that I could read such good words, and never be no better for it, and often feel it a sore labour and a heavy task beside, instead of a blessing and a privilege, as all good Christians does. It seemed like as all were barren and dark to me, and then them dreadful words,
Many shall seek to enter in, and shall not be able.
They like as they fair dried up my spirit. But one Sunday, when Mr. Hatfield gave out about the sacrament, I noticed where he said,
If there be any of you that cannot quiet his own conscience, but requireth further comfort or counsel, let him come to me, or some other discreet and learned minister of God's word, and open his grief.
So next Sunday morning afore service, I just looked into the vestry, and began a talking to the rector again. I hardly could fashion to take such a liberty, but I thought when my soul was at stake I shouldn't stick at a trifle. But he said he hadn't time to attend to me then.
And, indeed,
says he,
I've nothing to say to you but what I've said before. Take the sacrament, of course, and go on doing your duty, and if that won't serve you, nothing will. So don't bother me any more.
So then I went away. But I heard Maester Weston. Maester Weston was there, miss. This was his first Sunday at Horton, you know, and he was in the vestry, in his surplice, helping the rector on with his gown.
Yes, Nancy.
And I heard him ask Maester Hatfield who I was, and he says,
Oh, she's a canting old fool.
And I was very ill-grieved, Miss Grey, but I went to my seat, and I tried to do my duty as aforetime, but I got no peace, and I even took the sacrament, but I felt as though I were eating and drinking to my own damnation all the time, so I went home sorely troubled. But next day, afore I'd gotten fettled up, for indeed, miss, I'd no heart to sweeping and fettling and washing pots, so I sat me down in the muck. Who should come in but Mr. Weston? I started siding stuff then, and sweeping and doing, and I expected he'd begin a-calling me for my idle ways, as Master Hatfield would have done. But I was mistaken. He only bid me good morning, like in a quiet, decent way. So I dusted him a chair and fettled up the fireplace a bit, but I hadn't forgotten the rector's words, so says I wonder, sir, should you give yourself that trouble to come so far to see a canting old fool such as me? He seemed taken aback at that, but he would fain persuade me that the rector was only in jest, and when that wouldn't do, he says,
Well, Nancy, you shouldn't think so much about it. Mr. Hatfield was a little out of humour just then. You know we're none of us perfect. Even Moses spoke unadvisedly with his lips. But now, sit down a minute, if you can spare the time, and tell me all your doubts and fears, and I'll try to remove them.
So I sat me down and ant him. He was quite a stranger, you know, Miss Grey, and even younger nor Mr. Hatfield, I believe, and I had thought him not so pleasant looking as him, and rather a bit crossish at first to look at, but he spake so civil-like, and when the cat, poor thing, jumped on to his knee, he only stroked her and gave a bit of a smile, so I thought it was a good sign. For once, when she did so to the rector, he knocked her off, like as might be in scorn and anger, poor thing. But you can't expect a cat to know manners like a Christian, you know, Miss Grey.
No, of course not, Nancy. But what did Mr. Weston say then?
He said naught, but he listened to me as steady and patient as could be, and never a bit of scorn about him, and I went on and telled him all, just as I've telled you, and more too.
Well,
says he,
Mr. Hatfield was quite right in telling you to persevere in doing your duty, but in advising you to go to church and attend to the service and so on, he didn't mean that was the whole of a Christian's duty. He only thought you might there learn what more was to be done, and be led to take delight in those exercises, instead of finding them a task and a burden. And if you had asked him to explain those words that trouble you so much, I think he would have told you that if many shall seek to enter in at the strait gate, and shall not be able, it is their own sins that hinder them, just as a man with a large sack on his back might wish to pass through a narrow doorway, and find it impossible to do so, unless he would leave his sack behind him. But you, Nancy, I dare say, have no sins that you would not gladly throw aside, if you knew how.
Indeed, sir, you speak the truth, said I.
Well,
says he,
you know the first and great commandment, and the second, which is like unto it, on which the 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. You say you cannot love God, but it strikes me that if you rightly consider who and what he is, you cannot help it. He is your Father, your best friend. Every blessing, everything good, pleasant, or useful comes from him, and everything evil, everything you have reason to hate, to shun, or to fear, comes from Satan, his enemy as well as ours. And for this cause was God manifest in the flesh, that he might destroy the works of the devil. In one word, God is love, and the more of love we have within us, the nearer we are to him, and the more of his spirit we possess.
Well, sir, I said, if I can always think on these things, I think I might well love God. But how can I love my neighbours when they vex me and be so contrary and sinful as some of them is?
It may seem a hard matter,
says he,
to love our neighbours, who have so much of what is evil about them, and whose faults so often awaken the evil that lingers within ourselves. But remember that he made them, and he loves them, and whosoever loveth him that begat, loveth him that is begotten also. And if God so loveth us, that he gave his only begotten Son to die for us, we ought also to love one another. But if you cannot feel positive affection for those who do not care for you, you can at least try to do to them as you would they should do unto you. You can endeavour to pity their failings and excuse their offences, and to do all the good you can to those about you. And if you accustom yourself to this, Nancy, the very effort itself will make you love them in some degree, to say nothing of the good will your kindness would beget in them, though they might have little else that is good about them. If we love God and wish to serve him, let us try to be like him, to do his work, to labour for his glory, which is the good of man, to hasten the coming of his kingdom, which is the peace and happiness of all the world. However powerless we may seem to be in doing all the good we can through life, the humblest of us may do much towards it. Let us dwell in love, that he may dwell in us and we in him. The more happiness we bestow, the more we shall receive, even here, and the greater will be our reward in heaven when we rest from our labours.
I believe, miss, them is his very words, for I thought them o'er many a time. And then he took that Bible, and read bits here and there, and explained 'em clear as the day, and it seemed like a new light broke in on my soul, and I felt fair aglow about my heart, and only wished poor Bill and all the world could have been there and heard it all and rejoiced with me. After he was gone, Hannah Rogers, one of the neighbours, came in and wanted me to help her to wash. I told her I couldn't just then, for I hadn't set on the potatoes for the dinner, nor washed up the breakfast stuff yet. So then she began a-calling me for my nasty idle ways. I was a little bit vexed at first, but I never said nothing wrong to her. I only telled her, like all in a quiet way, that I'd had the new parson to see me, but I'd get done as quick as ever I could, and then I'd come and help her. So then she softened down, and my heart like as it warmed towards her, and in a bit we was very good friends. And so it is, Miss Grey, a soft answer turneth away wrath, but grievous words stir up anger. It isn't only in them you speak to, but in yourself.
Very true, Nancy. if we could always remember it."
"Ay, if we could."
"And did Mr. Weston ever come to see you again?"
"Yes, many a time, and since my eyes has been so bad, he sat and read to me by the half hour together. But you know, miss, he has other folks to see and other things to do, God bless him. And that next Sunday he preached such a sermon. His text was,
'Come unto me, all ye that labour and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest.'
and them two blessed verses that follows. You wasn't there, miss, you was with your friends then, but it made me so happy, and I am happy now, thank God, and I take pleasure now in doing little bits of odd jobs for my neighbours, such as a poor old body that's half blind can do, and they take it kindly of me, just as he said. You see, miss, I'm knitting a pair of stockings now. They're for Thomas Jackson. He's a queerish old body, and we've had many about it, 3 one anent other. At times we've differed sorely, so I thought I couldn't do better nor knit him a pair of warm stockings, and I felt to like him a deal better, poor old man, sin I began. It's turned out just as Mr. Weston said."
"Well, I'm very glad to see you so happy, Nancy, and so wise. But I must go now. I shall be wanted at the Hall," said I, and bidding her good-bye, I departed, promising to come again when I had time, and feeling nearly as happy as herself. At another time I went to read to a poor labourer, who was in the last stage of consumption. The young ladies had been to see him, and somehow a promise of reading had been extracted from them. But it was too much trouble, so they begged me to do it instead. I went, willingly enough, and there too I was gratified with the praises of Mr. Weston, both from the sick man and his wife. The former told me that he derived great comfort and benefit from the visits of the new parson, who frequently came to see him, and was another guest sort of man to Mr. Hatfield, who, before the other's arrival at Horton, had now and then paid him a visit, on which occasions he would always insist upon having the cottage door kept open, to admit the fresh air for his own convenience, without considering how it might injure the sufferer, and having opened his prayer book and hastily read over a part of the service for the sick, would hurry away again, if he did not stay to administer some harsh rebuke to the afflicted wife, or to make some thoughtless, not to say heartless, observation, rather calculated to increase than diminish the troubles of the suffering pair.
"Whereas,"
said the man,
"Mr. Weston will pray with me quite in a different fashion, and talk to me as kind as out, and oft read to me too, and sit beside me just like a brother."
"Just for all the world,"
exclaimed his wife.
"And about 3 weeks sin, when he seed how poor Jem shivered wi' cold, and what pitiful fires we kept, he axed if our stock o' coals was nearly done. I telled him it was, and we was ill set to get more. But you know, mum, I didn't think o' him helping us. But howsever, he sent us a sack o' coals next day, and we've had good fires ever sin, and a great blessing it is this winter time. But that's his way, Miss Grey. When he comes into a poor body's house a seeing sick folk, he like notices what they most stand in need on, and if he thinks they can't readily get it theirseln, he never says nought about it, but just gets it for 'em. And it isn't everybody 'at 'ud do that, 'at has as little as he has. For you know, mum, he's nowt at all to live on but what he gets for the rector, and that's little enough, they say."
I remembered then, with a species of exultation, that he had frequently been styled a vulgar brute by the amiable Miss Murray, because he wore a silver watch, and clothes not quite so bright and fresh as Mr. Hatfield's. In returning to the lodge I felt very happy, and thanked God that I had now something to think about, something to dwell on as a relief from the weary monotony, the lonely drudgery of my present life. For I was lonely. Never, from month to month, from year to year, except during my brief intervals of rest at home, did I see one creature to whom I could open my heart, or freely speak my thoughts with any hope of sympathy, or even comprehension. Never one, unless it were poor Nancy Brown, with whom I could enjoy a single moment of real social intercourse, or whose conversation was calculated to render me better, wiser, or happier than before, or who, as far as I could see, could be greatly benefited by mine. My only companions had been unamiable children, and ignorant, wrong-headed girls, from whose fatiguing folly unbroken solitude was often a relief most earnestly desired and dearly prized. But to be restricted to such associates was a serious evil, both in its immediate effects and the consequences that were likely to ensue. Never a new idea or stirring thought came to me from without, and such as rose within me were, for the most part, miserably crushed at once, or doomed to sicken or fade away because they could not see the light. Habitual associates are known to exercise a great influence over each other's minds and manners. Those whose actions are forever before our eyes, whose words are ever in our ears, will naturally lead us, albeit against our will, slowly, gradually, imperceptibly perhaps, to act and speak as they do. I will not presume to say how far this irresistible power of assimilation extends, but if one civilized man were doomed to pass a dozen years amid a race of intractable savages, unless he had power to improve them, I greatly question whether, at the close of that period, he would not have become, at least, a barbarian himself. And I, as I could not make my young companions better, feared exceedingly that they would make me worse, would gradually bring my feelings, habits, capacities, to the level of their own, without, however, imparting to me their light-heartedness and cheerful vivacity. Already I seemed to feel my intellect deteriorating, my heart petrifying, my soul contracting, and I trembled lest my very moral perceptions should become deadened, my distinctions of right and wrong confounded, and all my better faculties be sunk, at last, beneath the baneful influence of such a mode of life. The gross vapours of earth were gathering around me, and closing in upon my inward heaven. And thus it was that Mr. Weston rose at length upon me, appearing like the morning star in my horizon, to save me from the fear of utter darkness, and I rejoiced that I had now a subject for contemplation that was above me, not beneath. I was glad to see that all the world was not made up of Bloomfields, Murrays, Hatfields, Ashbys, etc., and that human excellence was not a mere dream of the imagination. When we hear a little good and no harm of a person, it is easy and pleasant to imagine more. In short, it is needless to analyse all my thoughts, but Sunday was now become a day of peculiar delight to me. I was now almost broken into the back corner in the carriage, for I liked to hear him, and I liked to see him too, though I knew he was not handsome, or even what is called agreeable, in outward aspect, but certainly he was not ugly. In stature he was a very little, above the middle size. The outline of his face would be pronounced too square for beauty, but to me it announced decision of character. His dark brown hair was not carefully curled, like Mr. Hatfield's, but simply brushed aside, over a broad white forehead. The eyebrows, I suppose, were too projecting, but from under those dark brows there gleamed an eye of singular power, brown in colour, not large, and somewhat deep-set, but strikingly brilliant, and full of expression. There was character, too, in the mouth, something that bespoke a man of firm purpose and an habitual thinker, and when he smiled—but I will not speak of that yet, for at the time I mention I had never seen him smile, and indeed his general appearance did not impress me with the idea of a man given to such a relaxation, nor of such an individual as the cottagers described him. I had early formed my opinion of him, and in spite of Miss Murray's objurgations, was fully convinced that he was a man of strong sense, firm faith, and ardent piety, but thoughtful and stern; and when I found that, to his other good qualities, was added that of true benevolence and gentle, considerate kindness, the discovery, perhaps, delighted me the more, as I had not been prepared to expect it.
End of chapter 11. Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. The Shower.
The next visit I paid to Nancy Brown was in the second week in March, for though I had many spare minutes during the day, I seldom could look upon an hour as entirely my own, since, where everything was left to the caprices of Miss Matilda and her sister, there could be no order or regularity. Whatever occupation I chose, when not actually busied about them or their concerns, I had, as it were, to keep my loins girded, my shoes on my feet, and my staff in my hand; for not to be immediately forthcoming when called for, was regarded as a grave and inexcusable offence, not only by my pupils and their mother, but by the very servant, who came in breathless haste to call me, exclaiming,
"You ought to go to the schoolroom directly, ma'am. The young ladies are waiting."
Climax of horror! Actually waiting for their governess! But this time I was pretty sure of an hour or two to myself, for Matilda was preparing for a long ride, and Rosalie was dressing for a dinner party at Lady Ashby's. So I took the opportunity of repairing to the widow's cottage, where I found her in some anxiety about her cat, which had been absent all day. I comforted her with as many anecdotes of that animal's roving propensities as I could recollect.
"I'm feared of the gamekeepers,"
said she.
"That's all that I could think on. If the young gentlemen had been at home, I should have thought they'd been setting their dogs on her and worried her, poor thing, as they did many a poor thing's cat. But I haven't that to be feared on now."
Nancy's eyes were better, but still far from well. She had been trying to make a Sunday shirt for her son, but told me she could only bear to do a little bit at it now and then, so that it progressed but slowly, though the poor lad wanted it sadly. So I proposed to help her a little, after I had read to her, for I had plenty of time that evening, and need not return till dusk. She thankfully accepted the offer.
"And you'll be a bit of company for me too, miss,"
said she.
"I like as I feel lonesome without my cat."
But when I had finished reading, and done the half of a seam, with Nancy's capacious brass thimble fitted on to my finger by means of a roll of paper, I was disturbed by the entrance of Mr. Weston, with the identical cat in his arms. I now saw that he could smile, and very pleasantly too.
"I've done you a piece of good service, Nancy,"
he began. Then, seeing me, he acknowledged my presence by a slight bow. I should have been invisible to Hatfield, or any other gentleman of those parts.
"I've delivered your cat,"
he continued,
"from the hands, or rather the gun, of Mr. Murray's gamekeeper."
"God bless you, sir!"
cried the grateful old woman, ready to weep for joy as she received her favourite from his arms.
"Take care of it,"
said he,
"and don't let it go near the rabbit warren, for the gamekeeper swears he'll shoot it if he sees it there again. He would have done so today if I had not been in time to stop him. I believe it is raining, Miss Grey,"
added he, more quietly, observing that I had put aside my work and was preparing to depart.
"Don't let me disturb you. I shan't stay 2 minutes."
"You'll both stay while this shower gets over,"
said Nancy, as she stirred the fire and placed another chair beside it.
"What? There's room for all."
"I can see better here, thank you, Nancy," replied I, taking my work to the window, where she had the goodness to suffer me to remain unmolested, while she got a brush to remove the cat's hairs from Mr. Weston's coat, carefully wiped the rain from his hat, and gave the cat its supper, busily talking all the time, now thanking her clerical friend for what he had done, now wondering how the cat had found out the warren, and now lamenting the probable consequences of such a discovery. He listened with a quiet, good-natured smile, and at length took a seat in compliance with her pressing invitations, but repeated that he did not mean to stay.
"I have another place to go to,"
said he,
"and I see,"
glancing at the book on the table,
"someone else has been reading to you."
"Yes, sir. Miss Grey has been as kind as read me a chapter, and now she's helping me with the shirt for our bill. But I'm feared she'll be cold there. Won't you come to the fire, miss?"
"No, thank you, Nancy. I'm quite warm. I must go as soon as the shower is over."
"Oh, miss, you said you could stop while dusk,"
cried the provoking old woman, and Mr. Weston seized his hat.
"Nay, sir,"
exclaimed she,
"pray don't go now while it rains so fast."
"But it strikes me I'm keeping your visitor away from the fire."
"No, you're not, Mr. Weston," replied I, hoping there was no harm in a falsehood of that description.
"No, sure,"
cried Nancy.
"Why, there's lots of room."
"Miss Grey,"
said he, half jestingly, as if he felt it necessary to change the present subject, whether he had anything particular to say or not.
"I wish you could make my peace with the squire when you see him. He was by when I rescued Nancy's cat, and did not quite approve of the deed. I told him I thought he might better spare all his rabbits than she her cat, for which audacious assertion he treated me to some rather ungentlemanly language, and I fear I retorted a trifle too warmly."
"Oh, lawful sir, I hope you didn't fall out with the maester for the sake of my cat. He cannot bide answering again, can the maester?"
"Oh, it's no matter, Nancy. I don't care about it, really. I said nothing very uncivil, and I suppose Mr. Murray is accustomed to use rather strong language when he's heated."
"Ay, sir, it's a pity."
"And now I really must go. I have to visit a place a mile beyond this, and you would not have me return in the dark. Besides, it has nearly done raining now. So, good evening, Nancy. Good evening, Miss Grey."
"Good evening, Mr. Weston. But don't depend upon me for making your peace with Mr. Murray, for I never see him to speak to."
"Don't you? It can't be helped, then,"
replied he, in dolorous resignation. Then, with a peculiar half-smile, he added,
"But never mind. I imagine the squire has more to apologize for than I,"
and left the cottage. I went on with my sewing as long as I could see, and then bade Nancy good evening, checking her too lively gratitude by the undeniable assurance that I had only done for her what she would have done for me if she had been in my place and I in hers. I hastened back to Horton Lodge, where, having entered the schoolroom, I found the tea-table all in confusion, the tray flooded with slops, and Miss Matilda in a most ferocious humour.
Miss Grey, whatever have you been about?
I've had tea half an hour ago and had to make it myself and drink it all alone. I wish you would come in sooner.
I've been to see Nancy Brown. I thought you would not be back from your ride.
How could I ride in the rain, I should like to know? The damned pelting shower was vexatious enough, coming on when I was just in full swing, and then to come and find nobody in to tea, and you know I can't make the tea as I like it.
I didn't think of the shower, replied I, and indeed the thought of its driving her home had never entered my head.
No, of course. You were under shelter yourself, and you never thought of other people.
I bore her coarse reproaches with astonishing equanimity, even with cheerfulness, for I was sensible that I had done more good to Nancy Brown than harm to her, and perhaps some other thoughts assisted to keep up my spirits, and impart a relish to the cup of cold, overdrawn tea, and a charm to the otherwise unsightly table, and, I had almost said, to Miss Matilda's unamiable face. But she soon betook herself to the stables, and left me to the quiet enjoyment of my solitary meal.
End of chapter 12. Of Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. The Primroses.
Miss Murray now always went twice to church, for she so loved admiration that she could not bear to lose a single opportunity of obtaining it, and she was so sure of it wherever she showed herself, that, whether Harry Meltham and Mr. Green were there or not, there was certain to be somebody present who would not be insensible to her charms, besides the rector, whose official capacity generally obliged him to attend. Usually, also, if the weather permitted, both she and her sister would walk home. Matilda, because she hated the confinement of the carriage; she, because she disliked the privacy of it, and enjoyed the company that generally enlivened the first mile of the journey in walking from the church to Mr. Green's park gates, near which commenced the private road to Horton Lodge, which lay in the opposite direction, while the highway conducted in a straightforward course to the still more distant mansion of Sir Hugh Meltham. Thus there was always a chance of being accompanied, so far, either by Harry Meltham, with or without Miss Meltham, or Mr. Green, with perhaps one or both of his sisters, and any gentlemen visitors they might have. Whether I walked with the young ladies or rode with their parents depended upon their own capricious will. If they chose to take me, I went. If, for reasons best known to themselves, they chose to go alone, I took my seat in the carriage. I liked walking better, but a sense of reluctance to obtrude my presence on anyone who did not desire it always kept me passive on these and similar occasions, and I never inquired into the causes of their varying whims. Indeed, this was the best policy, for to submit and oblige was the governess's part, to consult their own pleasure was that of the pupils. But when I did walk, the first half of journey was generally a great nuisance to me. As none of the before-mentioned ladies and gentlemen ever noticed me, it was disagreeable to walk beside them, as if listening to what they said, or wishing to be thought one of them, while they talked over me, or across; and if their eyes, in speaking, chanced to fall on me, it seemed as if they looked on vacancy, as if they either did not see me, or were very desirous to make it appear so. It was disagreeable, too, to walk behind, and thus appear to acknowledge my own inferiority, for, in truth, I considered myself pretty nearly as good as the best of them, and wished them to know that I did so, and not to imagine that I looked upon myself as a mere domestic, who knew her own place too well to walk beside such fine ladies and gentlemen as they were, though her young ladies might choose to have her with them, and even condescend to converse with her when no better company were at hand. Thus, I am almost ashamed to confess it, but indeed I gave myself no little trouble in my endeavours, if I did keep up with them, to appear perfectly unconscious or regardless of their presence, as if I were wholly absorbed in my own reflections, or the contemplation of surrounding objects; or, if I lingered behind, it was some bird or insect, some tree or flower, that attracted my attention, and having duly examined that, I would pursue my walk alone, at a leisurely pace until my pupils had bidden adieu to their companions and turned off into the quiet private road. One such occasion I particularly well remember. It was a lovely afternoon about the close of March. Mr. Green and his sisters had sent their carriage back empty, in order to enjoy the bright sunshine and balmy air in a sociable walk home along with their visitors, Captain Somebody and Lieutenant Somebody else, a couple of military fops, and the Misses Murray, who, of course, contrived to join them. Such a party was highly agreeable to Rosalie, but not finding it equally suitable to my taste, I presently fell back and began to botanize and entomologize along the green banks and budding hedges, till the company was considerably in advance of me, and I could hear the sweet song of the happy lark. Then my spirit of misanthropy began to melt away beneath the soft pure air and genial sunshine. But sad thoughts of early childhood, and yearnings for departed joys, or for a brighter future lot, arose instead. As my eyes wandered over the steep banks covered with young grass and green-leaved plants, and surmounted by budding hedges, I longed intensely for some familiar flower that might recall the woody dales or green hillsides of home. The brown moorlands, of course, were out of the question. Such a discovery would make my eyes gush out with water, no doubt. But that was one of my greatest enjoyments now. At length I descried, high up between the twisted roots of an oak, 3 lovely primroses, peeping so sweetly from their hiding-place that the tears already started at the sight. But they grew so high above me that I tried in vain to gather 1 or 2, to dream over and to carry with me. I could not reach them unless I climbed the bank, which I was deterred from doing by hearing a footstep at that moment behind me, and was therefore about to turn away when I was startled by the words,
"Allow me to gather them for you, Miss Grey,"
spoken in the grave, low tones of a well-known voice. Immediately the flowers were gathered, and in my hand. It was Mr. Weston, of course. Who else would trouble himself to do so much for me? I thanked him, whether warmly or coldly I cannot tell, but certain I am that I did not express half the gratitude I felt. It was foolish, perhaps, to feel any gratitude at all, but it seemed to me, at that moment, as if this were a remarkable instance of his good nature, an act of kindness which I could not repay, but never should forget. So utterly unaccustomed was I to receive such civilities, so little prepared to expect them from anyone within 50 miles of Horton Lodge. Yet this did not prevent me from feeling a little uncomfortable in his presence, and I proceeded to follow my pupils at a much quicker pace than before, though, perhaps, if Mr. Weston had taken the hint and let me pass without another word, I might have repeated it an hour after, but he did not. A somewhat rapid walk for me was but an ordinary pace for him.
"Your young ladies have left you alone,"
said he. "Yes, they are occupied with more agreeable company."
"Then don't trouble yourself to overtake them."
I slackened my pace, but next moment regretted having done so. My companion did not speak, and I had nothing in the world to say, and feared he might be in the same predicament. At length, however, he broke the pause by asking, with a certain quiet abruptness peculiar to himself, if I liked flowers. "Yes, very much," I answered. "Wild flowers especially."
"I like wild flowers,"
said he.
"Others I don't care about, because I have no particular associations connected with them, except 1 or 2. What are your favourite flowers?"
"Primroses, bluebells, and heath blossoms."
"Not violets?"
"No, because, as you say, I have no particular associations connected with them, for there are no sweet violets among the hills and valleys round my home."
"It must be a great consolation to you to have a home, Miss Grey,"
observed my companion after a short pause.
"However remote, or however seldom visited, still it is something to look to."
"It is so much that I think I could not live without it," replied I, with an enthusiasm of which I immediately repented, for I thought it must have sounded essentially silly.
"Oh, yes, you could,"
said he, with a thoughtful smile.
"The ties that bind us to life are tougher than you imagine, or than anyone can who has not felt how roughly they may be pulled without breaking. You might be miserable without a home, but even you could live, and not so miserably as you suppose. The human heart is like India rubber. A little swells it, but a great deal will not burst it. If little more than nothing will disturb it, little less than all things will suffice to break it. As in the outer members of our frame, there is a vital power inherent in itself that strengthens it against external violence. Every blow that shakes it, will serve to harden it against a future stroke, as a constant labor thickens the skin of the hand and strengthens its muscles instead of wasting them away, so that a day of arduous toil that might excoriate a lady's palm would make no sensible impression on that of a hardy ploughman. I speak from experience, partly my own. There was a time when I thought as you do. At least, I was fully persuaded that home and its affections were the only things that made life tolerable, that if deprived of these, existence would become a burden hard to be endured. But now I have no home, unless you would dignify my 2 hired rooms at Horton by such a name, and not 12 months ago I lost the last and dearest of my early friends. And yet, not only I live, but I am not wholly destitute of hope and comfort, even for this life, though I must acknowledge that I can seldom enter even an humble cottage at the close of day, and see its inhabitants peaceably gathered around a cheerful hearth, without a feeling almost of envy at their domestic enjoyment.
"You don't know what happiness lies before you yet," said I. "You are now only in the commencement of your journey."
"The best of happiness,"
replied he,
"is mine already, the power and the will to be useful."
We now approached a stile communicating with a footpath that conducted to a farmhouse, where, I suppose, Mr. Weston purposed to make himself useful, for he presently took leave of me, crossed the stile, and traversed the path with his usual firm, elastic tread, leaving me to ponder his words as I continued my course alone. I had heard before that he had lost his mother not many months before he came. She then was the last and dearest of his early friends, and he had no home. I pitied him from my heart. I almost wept for sympathy, and this, I thought, accounted for the shade of premature thoughtfulness that so frequently clouded his brow, and obtained for him the reputation of a morose and sullen disposition with the charitable Miss Murray and all her kin. But, thought I, he is not so miserable as I should be under such a deprivation. He leads an active life, and a wide field for useful exertion lies before him. He can make friends, and he can make a home too, if he pleases, and doubtless he will please some time. God grant the partner of that home may be worthy of his choice, and make it a happy one, such a home as he deserves to have, and how delightful it would be to— But no matter what I thought. I began this book with the intention of concealing nothing, that those who liked might have the benefit of perusing a fellow creature's heart. But we have some thoughts that all the angels in heaven are welcome to behold, but not our brother men, not even the best and kindest among them. By this time the Greens had taken themselves to their own abode, and the Murrays had turned down the private road, whither I hastened to follow them. I found the 2 girls warm in an animated discussion on the respective merits of the 2 young officers, but on seeing me, Rosalie broke off in the middle of a sentence to exclaim, with malicious glee,
"Oho, Miss Grey! You're come at last, are you? No wonder you lingered so long behind, and no wonder you always stand up so vigorously for Mr. Weston when I abuse him. Aha! I see it all now."
"Now come, Miss Murray, don't be foolish," said I, attempting a good-natured laugh. "You know such nonsense can make no impression on me." But she still went on talking such intolerable stuff, her sister helping her with appropriate fiction coined for the occasion, that I thought it necessary to say something in my own justification. "What folly all this is!" I exclaimed. "If Mr. Weston's road happened to be the same as mine for a few yards, and if he chose to exchange a word or two in passing, what is there so remarkable in that? I assure you I never spoke to him before, except once."
"Where?
Where?
And when?"
cried they eagerly. "In Nancy's cottage."
"Aha! You've met him there, have you?"
exclaimed Rosalie, with exultant laughter.
"Ah, now, Matilda, I've found out why she's so fond of going to Nancy Brown's. She goes there to flirt with Mr. Weston."
"Really, that is not worth contradicting. I only saw him there once, I tell you, and how could I know he was coming?" Irritated as I was at their foolish mirth and vexatious imputations, the uneasiness did not continue long. When they had had their laugh out, they returned again to the captain and lieutenant, and while they disputed and commented upon them, my indignation rapidly cooled. The cause of it was quickly forgotten, and I turned my thoughts into a pleasanter channel. Thus we proceeded up the park, and entered the hall, and as I ascended the stairs to my own chamber, I had but one thought within me. My heart was filled to overflowing with one single earnest wish. Having entered the room and shut the door, I fell upon my knees, and offered up a fervent but not impetuous prayer. "Thy will be done," I strove to say throughout, but "Father, all things are possible with thee, and may it be thy will," was sure to follow. That wish, that prayer, both men and women would have scorned me for. "But, Father, thou wilt not despise," I said, and felt that it was true. It seemed to me that another's welfare was at least as ardently implored for as my own; nay, even that was the principal object of my heart's desire. I might have been deceiving myself, but that idea gave me confidence to ask, and power to hope I did not ask in vain. As for the primroses, I kept 2 of them in a glass in my room, until they were completely withered, and the housemaid threw them out, and the petals of the other I pressed between the leaves of my Bible. I have them still, and mean to keep them always.
End of chapter 13. Of Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14. The Rector.
The following day was as fine as the preceding one. Soon after breakfast Miss Matilda, having galloped and blundered through a few unprofitable lessons, and vengeably thumped the piano for an hour, in a terrible humour with both me and it, because her mamma would not give her a holiday, had betaken herself to her favourite places of resort, the yards, the stables, and the dog-kennels, and Miss Murray was gone forth to enjoy a quiet ramble with a new fashionable novel for her companion, leaving me in the schoolroom hard at work upon a water-colour drawing which I had promised to do for her, and which she insisted upon my finishing that day. At my feet lay a little rough terrier. It was the property of Miss Matilda, but she hated the animal, and intended to sell it, alleging that it was quite spoiled. It was really an excellent dog of its kind, but she affirmed it was fit for nothing, and had not even the sense to know its own mistress. The fact was, she had purchased it when but a small puppy, insisting at first that no one should touch it but herself, but soon becoming tired of so helpless and troublesome a nursling, she had gladly yielded to my entreaties to be allowed to take charge of it, and I, by carefully nursing the little creature from infancy to adolescence, of course had obtained its affections, a reward I should have greatly valued, and looked upon as far outweighing all the trouble I had had with it, had not poor Snap's grateful feelings exposed him to many a harsh word and many a spiteful kick and pinch from his owner, and were he not now in danger of being put away in consequence, or transferred to some rough stony-hearted master. But how could I help it? I could not make the dog hate me by cruel treatment, and she would not propitiate him by kindness. However, while I thus sat, working away with my pencil, Mrs. Murray came, half sailing, half bustling, into the room.
"Miss Grey,"
she began.
"Dear, how can you sit at your drawing such a day as this?"
She thought I was doing it for my own pleasure.
"I wonder you don't put on your bonnet and go out with the young ladies."
"I think, ma'am, Miss Murray is reading, and Miss Matilda is amusing herself with her dogs."
"If you would try to amuse Miss Matilda yourself a little more, I think she would not be driven to seek amusement in the companionship of dogs and horses and grooms so much as she is. And if you would be a little more cheerful and conversable with Miss Murray, she would not so often go wandering in the fields with a book in her hand. However, I don't want to vex you,"
added she, seeing, I suppose, that my cheeks burned and my hand trembled with some unamiable emotion.
"Do, pray, try not to be so touchy. There's no speaking to you else. And tell me if you know where Rosalie is gone, and why she likes to be so much alone."
"She says she likes to be alone when she has a new book to read."
"But why can't she read it in the park or the garden? Why should she go into the fields and lanes? And how is it that Mr. Hatfield so often finds her out? She told me last week he'd walked his horse by her side all up Moss Lane, and now I'm sure it was he I saw from my dressing-room window, walking so briskly past the park gates, and on towards the field where she so frequently goes. I wish you would go and see if she is there, and just gently remind her that it is not proper for a young lady of her rank and prospects to be wandering about by herself in that manner, exposed to the attentions of any one that presumes to address her, like some poor neglected girl that has no park to walk in and no friends to take care of her. and tell her that her papa would be extremely angry if he knew of her treating Mr. Hatfield in the familiar manner that I fear she does. And, oh, if any governess had but half a mother's watchfulness, half a mother's anxious care, I should be saved this trouble, and you would see at once the necessity of keeping your eye upon her, and making your company agreeable to— Well, go, there's no time to be lost,
cried she, seeing that I had put away my drawing materials, and was waiting in the doorway for the conclusion of her address. According to her prognostications, I found Miss Murray in her favourite field just without the park, and unfortunately not alone, for the tall, stately figure of Mr. Hatfield was slowly sauntering by her side. Here was a poser for me. It was my duty to interrupt the tete-a-tete, but how was it to be done? Mr. Hatfield could not be driven away by so insignificant a person as I, and to go and place myself on the other side of Miss Murray, and intrude my unwelcome presence upon her, without noticing her companion, was a piece of rudeness I could not be guilty of. Neither had I the courage to cry aloud from the top of the field that she was wanted elsewhere. So I took the intermediate course of walking slowly but steadily towards them, resolving, if my approach failed to scare away the beau, to pass by and tell Miss Murray her mamma wanted her. She certainly looked very charming as she strolled, lingering along under the budding horse-chestnut trees that stretched their long arms over the park palings, with her closed book in one hand, and in the other a graceful sprig of myrtle, which served her as a very pretty plaything, her bright ringlets escaping profusely from her little bonnet, and gently stirred by the breeze, her fair cheek flushed with gratified vanity, her smiling blue eyes, now slyly glancing towards her admirer, now gazing downward at her myrtle sprig. But Snap, running before me, interrupted her in the midst of some half-pert, half-playful repartee, by catching hold of her dress, and vehemently tugging thereat, till Mr. Hatfield, with his cane, administered a resounding thwack upon the animal's skull, and sent it yelping back to me, with a clamorous outcry that afforded the reverend gentleman great amusement. But seeing me so near, he thought, I suppose, he might as well be taking his departure; and, as I stooped to caress the dog, with ostentatious pity to show my disapproval of his severity, I heard him say,
"When shall I see you again, Miss Murray?"
"At church, I suppose,"
replied she,
"unless your business chances to bring you here again at the precise moment when I happen to be walking by."
"I could always manage to have business here, if I knew precisely when and where to find you."
"But if I would, I could not inform you, for I am so immethodical, I never can tell to-day what I shall do to-morrow."
"Then give me that, meantime, to comfort me,"
said he, half jestingly and half in earnest, extending his hand for the sprig of myrtle.
"No, indeed I shan't."
"Do, pray do. I shall be the most miserable of men if you don't. You cannot be so cruel as to deny me a favour so easily granted, and yet so highly prized,"
pleaded he, as ardently as if his life depended on it. By this time I stood within a very few yards of them, impatiently waiting his departure.
"There, then, take it and go,"
said Rosalie. He joyfully received the gift, murmured something that made her blush and toss her head, but with a little laugh that showed her displeasure was entirely affected, and then with a courteous salutation withdrew.
"Did you ever see such a man, Miss Grey?"
said she, turning to me.
"I'm so glad you came. I thought I never should get rid of him, and I was so terribly afraid of papa seeing him."
"Has he been with you long?"
"No, not long, but he's so extremely impertinent, and he's always hanging about, pretending his business or his clerical duties require his attendance in these parts, and really watching for poor me, and pouncing upon me wherever he sees me."
"Well, your mamma thinks you ought not to go beyond the park or garden without some discreet matronly person like me to accompany you, and keep off all intruders. She descried Mr. Hatfield hurrying past the park gates, and forthwith dispatched me with instructions to seek you up and to take care of you, and likewise to warn—"
"Oh, mamma's so tiresome, as if I couldn't take care of myself. She bothered me before about Mr. Hatfield, and I told her she might trust me. I never should forget my rank and station for the most delightful man that ever breathed. I wish he would go down on his knees to-morrow and implore me to be his wife, that I might just show her how mistaken she is in supposing that I could ever. Oh, it provokes me so, to think that I could be such a fool as to fall in love. It is quite beneath the dignity of a woman to do such a thing. Love! I detest the word. As applied to one of our sex, I think it a perfect insult. A preference I might acknowledge, but never for one like poor Mr. Hatfield, who has not 700 a year to bless himself with. I like to talk to him, because he's so clever and amusing. I wish Sir Thomas Ashby were half as nice. Besides, I must have somebody to flirt with, and no one else has the sense to come here. And when we go out, Mamma won't let me flirt with anybody but Sir Thomas, if he's there, and if he's not there, I'm bound hand and foot, for fear somebody should go and make up some exaggerated story, and put it into his head that I'm engaged, or likely to be engaged, to somebody else, or what is more probable, for fear his nasty old mother should see or hear of my ongoings, and conclude that I'm not a fit wife for her excellent son, as if the said son were not the greatest scamp in Christendom, and as if any woman of common decency were not a world too good for him.
Is it really so, Miss Murray? And does your mamma know it, and yet wish you to marry him?
To be sure, she does. She knows more against him than I do, I believe. She keeps it from me, lest I should be discouraged, not knowing how little I care about such things. For it's no great matter, really. He'll be all right when he's married, as mamma says, and reformed rakes make the best husbands, everybody knows. I only wish he were not so ugly, that's all I think about. But then there's no choice here in the country, and papa will not let us go to London.
But I should think Mr. Hatfield would be far better.
And so he would, if he were Lord of Ashby Park. There's not a doubt of it. But the fact is, I must have Ashby Park, whoever shares it with me.
But Mr. Hatfield thinks you like him all this time. You don't consider how bitterly he will be disappointed when he finds himself mistaken.
No, indeed. It will be a proper punishment for his presumption. For ever daring to think I could like him. I should enjoy nothing so much as lifting the veil from his eyes.
The sooner you do it, the better, then.
No, I tell you I like to amuse myself with him. Besides, he doesn't really think I like him. I take good care of that. You don't know how cleverly I manage. He may presume to think he can induce me to like him, for which I shall punish him as he deserves.
Well, mind you don't give too much reason for such presumption, that's all, replied I. But all my exhortations were in vain. They only made her somewhat more solicitous to disguise her wishes and her thoughts from me. She talked no more to me about the rector, but I could see that her mind, if not her heart, was fixed upon him still, and that she was intent upon obtaining another interview. For though, in compliance with her mother's request, I was now constituted the companion of her rambles for a time, she still persisted in wandering in the fields and lanes that lay in the nearest proximity to the road, and whether she talked to me, or read the book she carried in her hand, she kept continually pausing to look round her, or gaze up the road to see if any one was coming, and if a horseman trotted by, I could tell by her unqualified abuse of the poor equestrian, whoever he might be, that she hated him because he was not Mr. Hatfield. Surely, thought I, she is not so indifferent to him as she believes herself to be, or would have others to believe her, and her mother's anxiety is not so wholly causeless as she affirms. 3 days passed away, and he did not make his appearance. On the afternoon of the 4th, as we were walking beside the park palings in the memorable field, each furnished with a book, for I always took care to provide myself with something to be doing when she did not require me to talk, she suddenly interrupted my studies by exclaiming,
"Oh, Miss Grey, do be so kind as to go and see Mark Wood, and take his wife half a crown from me. I should have given or sent it a week ago, but quite forgot. There," said
she, throwing me her purse and speaking very fast.
"Never mind getting it out now, but take the purse and give them what you like. I would go with you, but I want to finish this volume. I'll come and meet you when I've done it. Be quick, will you, and, oh, wait, hadn't you better read to him a bit? Run to the house and get some sort of a good book. Anything will do."
I did as I was desired, but, suspecting something from her hurried manner and the suddenness of the request, I just glanced back before I quitted the field, and there was Mr. Hatfield about to enter at the gate below. By sending me to the house for a book, she had just prevented my meeting him on the road. Never mind, thought I, there'll be no great harm done. Poor Mark will be glad of the half-crown, and perhaps of the good book too, and if the rector does steal Miss Rosalie's heart, it will only humble her pride a little, and if they do get married at last, it will only save her from a worse fate, and she will be quite a good enough partner for him, and he for her. Mark Wood was the consumptive labourer whom I mentioned before. He was now rapidly wearing away. Miss Murray, by her liberality, obtained literally the blessing of him that was ready to perish, for though the half-crown could be of very little service to him, he was glad of it for the sake of his wife and children, so soon to be widowed and fatherless. After I had sat a few minutes, and read a little for the comfort and edification of himself and his afflicted wife, I left them, but I had not proceeded 50 yards before I encountered Mr. Weston, apparently on his way to the same abode. He greeted me in his usual quiet, unaffected way, stopped to inquire about the condition of the sick man and his family, and with a sort of unconscious, brotherly disregard to ceremony, took from my hand the book out of which I had been reading, turned over its pages, made a few brief but very sensible remarks, and restored it, then told me about some poor sufferer he had just been visiting, talked a little about Nancy Brown, made a few observations upon my little rough friend the terrier, that was frisking at his feet, and finally upon the beauty of the weather, and departed. I have omitted to give a detail of his words, from a notion that they would not interest the reader as they did me, and not because I have forgotten them. No, I remember them well, for I thought them over and over again in the course of that day, and many succeeding ones, I know not how often, and recalled every intonation of his deep, clear voice, every flash of his quick brown eye, and every gleam of his pleasant but too transient smile. Such a confession will look very absurd, I fear, but no matter. I have written it, and they that read it will not know the writer. While I was walking along, happy within, and pleased with all around, Miss Murray came hastening to meet me, her buoyant step, flushed cheek, and radiant smiles showing that she too was happy in her own way. Running up to me, she put her arm through mine, and without waiting to recover breath, began,
"Now, Miss Grey, think yourself highly honoured, for I'm come to tell you my news before I've breathed a word of it to anyone else."
"Well, what is it?"
"Oh, such news! In the first place, you must know that Mr. Hatfield came upon me just after you were gone. I was in such a way, for fear papa or mamma should see him, but you know I couldn't call you back again, and so, oh dear, I can't tell you all about it now, for there's Matilda I see in the park, and I must go and open my budget to her. But however, Hatfield was most uncommonly audacious, unspeakably complimentary, and unprecedentedly tender, tried to be so at least. He didn't succeed very well in that, because it's not his vein. I'll tell you all he said another time."
"But what did you say? I'm more interested in that."
"I'll tell you that too at some future period. I happened to be in a very good humour just then, but, though I was complacent and gracious enough, I took care not to compromise myself in any possible way. But, however, the conceited wretch chose to interpret my amiability of temper his own way, and at last presumed upon my indulgence so far. What do you think? He actually made me an offer."
"And you?"
I proudly drew myself up, and with the greatest coolness expressed my astonishment at such an occurrence, and hoped he had seen nothing in my conduct to justify his expectations. You should have seen how his countenance fell. He went perfectly white in the face. I assured him that I esteemed him and all that, but could not possibly accede to his proposals, and if I did, papa and mamma could never be brought to give their consent.
"But if they could,"
said he,
"would yours be wanting?"
"Certainly, Mr. Hatfield," I replied, with a cool decision which quelled all hope at once. Oh, if you had seen how dreadfully mortified he was, how crushed to the earth by his disappointment! Really, I almost pitied him myself. One more desperate attempt, however, he made. After a silence of considerable duration, during which he struggled to be calm and I to be grave, for I felt a strong propensity to laugh, which would have ruined all, he said, with the ghost of a smile,
"But tell me plainly, Miss Murray, if I had the wealth of Sir Hugh Meltham, or the prospects of his eldest son, would you still refuse me? Answer me truly, upon your honour."
"Certainly," said I, "that would make no difference whatever." It was a great lie, but he looked so confident in his own attractions still, that I determined not to leave him one stone upon another. He looked me full in the face, but I kept my countenance so well that he could not imagine I was saying anything more than the actual truth.
"Then it's all over, I suppose,"
he said, looking as if he could have died on the spot with vexation in the intensity of his despair. But he was angry as well as disappointed. There was he, suffering so unspeakably, and there was I, the pitiless cause of it all, so utterly impenetrable to all the artillery of his looks and words, so calmly cold and proud, he could not but feel some resentment, and with singular bitterness he began.
I certainly did not expect this, Miss Murray. I might say something about your past conduct, and the hopes you have led me to foster, but I forbear, on condition.
No conditions, Mr. Hatfield, said I, now truly indignant at his insolence.
Then let me beg it as a favour.
He replied, lowering his voice at once and taking a humbler tone.
Let me entreat you that you will not mention this affair to any one whatever. If you will keep silence about it, there need be no unpleasantness on either side. Nothing, I mean, beyond what is quite unavoidable. For my own feelings I will endeavour to keep to myself, if I cannot annihilate them. I will try to forgive, if I cannot forget the cause of my sufferings. I will not suppose, Miss Murray, that you know how deeply you have injured me. I would not have you aware of it, but if, in addition to the injury you have already done me, pardon me, but whether innocently or not, you have done it. And if you add to it by giving publicity to this unfortunate affair, or naming it at all, you will find that I too can speak, and though you scorn my love, you will hardly scorn my...
He stopped, but he bit his bloodless lip, and looked so terribly fierce that I was quite frightened. However, my pride upheld me still, and I answered disdainfully, I do not know what motive you suppose I could have for naming it to anyone, Mr. Hatfield, but if I were disposed to do so, you would not deter me by threats, and it is scarcely the part of a gentleman to attempt it.
Pardon me, Miss Murray,
said he.
I have loved you so intensely, I do still adore you so deeply, that I would not willingly offend you. But though I never have loved, and never can love any woman as I have loved you, it is equally certain that I never was so ill-treated by any. On the contrary, I have always found your sex the kindest and most tender and obliging of God's creation, till now.
Think of the conceited fellow saying that.
And the novelty of the harshness of the lesson you have taught me to-day, and the bitterness of being disappointed in the only quarter on which the happiness of my life depended, must excuse any appearance of asperity. If my presence is disagreeable to you, Miss Murray,
he said, for I was looking about me to show how little I cared for him, so he thought I was tired of him, I suppose.
If my presence is disagreeable to you, Miss Murray, you have only to promise me the favour I named, and I will relieve you at once. There are many ladies, some even in this parish, who would be delighted to accept what you have so scornfully trampled under your feet. They would be naturally inclined to hate one whose surpassing loveliness has so completely estranged my heart from them, and blinded me to their attractions. And a single hint of the truth from me to one of these would be sufficient to raise such a talk against you as would seriously injure your prospects, and diminish your chance of success with any other gentleman you, or your mamma, might design to entangle.
What do you mean, sir? Said I, ready to stamp with passion.
I mean that this affair from beginning to end appears to me like a case of arrant flirtation, to say the least of it. Such a case as you would find rather inconvenient to have blazoned through the world, especially with the additions and exaggerations of your female rivals, who would be too glad to publish the matter if I only gave them a handle to it. But I promise you on the faith of a gentleman that no word or syllable that could tend to your prejudice shall ever escape my lips, provided you will...
Well, well, I won't mention it, said I. You may rely upon my silence, if that can afford you any consolation.
You promise it?
Yes, I answered, for I wanted to get rid of him now.
Farewell, then,
said he, in a most doleful, heartsick tone, and with a look where pride vainly struggled against despair. He turned and went away, longing no doubt to get home, that he might shut himself up in his study and cry, if he doesn't burst into tears before he gets there.
But you have broken your promise already, said I, truly horrified at her perfidy.
Oh, it's only to you. I know you won't repeat it.
Certainly I shall not. But you say you are going to tell your sister, and she will tell your brothers when they come home, and Brown immediately, if you do not tell her yourself. And Brown will blazon it, or be the means of blazoning it, throughout the country.
No, indeed she won't. We shall not tell her at all, unless it be under the promise of the strictest secrecy.
But how can you expect her to keep her promises better than her more enlightened mistress?
Well, well, she shan't hear it then,
said Miss Murray, somewhat snappishly. But you will tell your mamma, of course, pursued I, and she will tell your papa.
Of course I shall tell mamma. That is the very thing that pleases me so much. I shall now be able to convince her how mistaken she was in her fears about me.
Oh, that's it, is it? I was wondering what it was that delighted you so much.
Yes, and another thing is that I've humbled Mr. Hatfield so charmingly, and another, why, you must allow me some share of female vanity. I don't pretend to be without that most essential attribute of our sex. And if you had seen poor Hatfield's intense eagerness in making his ardent declaration and his flattering proposal, and his agony of mind that no effort of pride could conceal on being refused, you would have allowed I had some cause to be gratified.
The greater his agony, I should think, the less your cause for gratification.
Oh, nonsense,
cried the young lady, shaking herself with vexation.
You either can't understand me or you won't. If I had not confidence in your magnanimity, I should think you envied me. But you will perhaps comprehend this cause of pleasure, which is as great as any, namely, that I am delighted with myself for my prudence, my self-command, my heartlessness, if you please. I was not a bit taken by surprise, not a bit confused, or awkward, or foolish. I just acted and spoke as I ought to have done, and was completely my own mistress throughout. And here was a man decidedly good-looking. Jane and Susan Green call him bewitchingly handsome. I suppose they're two of the ladies he pretends would be so glad to have him. But, however, he was certainly a very clever, witty, agreeable companion. Not what you call clever, but just enough to make him entertaining, and a man one needn't be ashamed of anywhere, and would not soon grow tired of. And to confess the truth, I rather liked him. Better even of late than Harry Meltham. And he evidently idolized me. And yet, though he came upon me all alone and unprepared, I had the wisdom, and the pride, and the strength to refuse him. And so scornfully and coolly as I did, I have good reason to be proud of that.
And are you equally proud of having told him that his having the wealth of Sir Hugh Meltham would make no difference to you, when that was not the case, and of having promised to tell no one of his misadventure, apparently without the slightest intention of keeping your promise?
Of course. What else could I do? You would not have had me. But I see, Miss Grey, you're not in a good temper. Here's Matilda. I'll see what she and mamma have to say about it.
She left me, offended at my want of sympathy, and thinking, no doubt, that I envied her. I did not. At least, I firmly believed I did not. I was sorry for her. I was amazed, disgusted at her heartless vanity. I wondered why so much beauty should be given to those who made so bad a use of it, and denied to some who would make it a benefit to both themselves and others. But God knows best, I concluded. There are, I suppose, some men as vain, as selfish, and as heartless as she is, and perhaps such women may be useful to punish them.
End of chapter 14. Of Agnes Grey by Anne Brontë. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15. The Walk.
Oh dear, I wish Hatfield had not been so precipitate,
said Rosalie next day at 4 p.m., as, with a portentous yawn, she laid down her worsted work and looked listlessly towards the window.
There's no inducement to go out now, and nothing to look forward to. The days will be so long and dull when there are no parties to enliven them, and there are none this week, or next either, that I know of.
Pity you were so cross to him,
observed Matilda, to whom this lamentation was addressed.
He'll never come again, and I suspect you liked him after all. I hoped you would have taken him for your beau and left dear Harry to me.
Hum! My beau must be an Adonis indeed, Matilda, the admired of all beholders, if I am to be contented with him alone. I'm sorry to lose Hatfield, I confess, but the first decent man, or number of men, that come to supply his place will be more than welcome. It's Sunday tomorrow. I do wonder how he'll look, and whether he'll be able to go through the service. Most likely he'll pretend he's got a cold, and make Mr. Weston do it all.
Not he,
exclaimed Matilda, somewhat contemptuously.
Fool as he is, he's not so soft as that comes to.
Her sister was slightly offended, but the event proved Matilda was right. The disappointed lover performed his pastoral duties as usual. Rosalie, indeed, affirmed he looked very pale and dejected. He might be a little paler, but the difference, if any, was scarcely perceptible. As for his dejection, I certainly did not hear his laugh ringing from the vestry as usual, nor his voice loud in hilarious discourse, though I did hear it uplifted in rating the sexton in a manner that made the congregation stare; and, in his transits to and from the pulpit and the communion table, there was more of a solemn pomp, and less of that irreverent, self-confident, or rather self-delighted imperiousness, with which he usually swept along, that air that seemed to say,
"You all reverence and adore me, I know; but if anyone does not, I defy him to the teeth."
But the most remarkable change was, that he never once suffered his eyes to wander in the direction of Mr. Murray's pew, and did not leave the church till we were gone. Mr. Hatfield had doubtless received a very severe blow, but his pride impelled him to use every effort to conceal the effects of it. He had been disappointed in his certain hope of obtaining not only a beautiful, and, to him, highly attractive wife, but one whose rank and fortune might give brilliance to far inferior charms. He was likewise, no doubt, intensely mortified by his repulse, and deeply offended at the conduct of Miss Murray throughout. It would have given him no little consolation to have known how disappointed she was to find him apparently so little moved, and to see that he was able to refrain from casting a single glance at her throughout both services; though, she declared, it showed he was thinking of her all the time, or his eyes would have fallen upon her, if it were only by chance. But if they had so chanced to fall, she would have affirmed it was because they could not resist the attraction. It might have pleased him, too, in some degree, to have seen how dull and dissatisfied she was throughout that week, the greater part of it at least, for lack of her usual source of excitement, and how often she regretted having used him up so soon, like a child that, having devoured its plum cake too hastily, sits sucking its fingers, and vainly lamenting its greediness. At length I was called upon, one fine morning, to accompany her in a walk to the village. Ostensibly she went to get some shades of Berlin wool, at a tolerably respectable shop, that was chiefly supported by the ladies of the vicinity. Really, I trust there is no breach of charity in supposing that she went with the idea of meeting either with the rector himself, or some other admirer by the way, for as we went along, she kept wondering what Hatfield would do or say if we met him, etc., etc. As we passed Mr. Green's park gates, she wondered whether he was at home, great stupid blockhead. As Lady Maltham's carriage passed us, she wondered what Mr. Harry was doing this fine day, and then began to abuse his elder brother for being such a fool as to get married and go and live in London. "Why," said I thought you wanted to live in London yourself."
Yes, because it's so dull here, but then he makes it still duller by taking himself off, and if he were not married, I might have him instead of that odious Sir Thomas.
Then, observing the prints of a horse's feet on the somewhat miry road, she wondered whether it was a gentleman's horse, and finally concluded it was, for the impressions were too small to have been made by a great clumsy cart horse. And then she wondered who the rider could be, and whether we should meet him coming back, for she was sure he had only passed that morning. And lastly, when we entered the village, and saw only a few of its humble inhabitants moving about, she wondered why the stupid people couldn't keep in their houses. She was sure she didn't want to see their ugly faces, and dirty vulgar clothes. It wasn't for that she came to Horton. Amid all this, I confess, I wondered too, in secret, whether we should meet, or catch a glimpse of somebody else, and as we passed his lodgings, I even went so far as to wonder whether he was at the window. On entering the shop, Miss Murray desired me to stand in the doorway while she transacted her business, and tell her if anyone passed. But alas, there was no one visible besides the villagers, except Jane and Susan Green, coming down the single street, apparently returning from a walk.
"Stupid things,"
muttered she, as she came out after having concluded her bargain.
"Why couldn't they have their dolt of a brother with them? Even he would be better than nothing."
She greeted them, however, with a cheerful smile, and protestations of pleasure at the happy meeting equal to their own. They placed themselves one on each side of her, and all three walked away chatting and laughing, as young ladies do when they get together, if they be but on tolerably intimate terms. But I, feeling myself to be one too many, left them to their merriment and lagged behind, as usual on such occasions. I had no relish for walking beside Miss Green, or Miss Susan, like one deaf and dumb, who could neither speak nor be spoken to. But this time I was not long alone. It struck me first as very odd, that just as I was thinking about Mr. Weston, he should come up and accost me. but afterwards, on due reflection, I thought there was nothing odd about it, unless it were the fact of his speaking to me, for on such a morning, and so near his own abode, it was natural enough that he should be about; and as for my thinking of him, I had been doing that, with little intermission, ever since we set out on our journey, so there was nothing remarkable in that.
You are alone again, Miss Grey?
Said he. Yes.
What kind of people are those ladies? The Mrs. Green?
I really don't know.
That's strange, when you live so near and see them so often.
Well, I suppose they are lively, good-tempered girls, but I imagine you must know them better than I do, yourself, for I never exchanged a word with either of them.
Indeed, they don't strike me as being particularly reserved.
Very likely they are not so to people of their own class, but they consider themselves as moving in quite a different sphere from me. He made no reply to this, but after a short pause he said,
I suppose it's these things, Miss Grey, that make you think you cannot live without a home?
Not exactly. The fact is, I am too socially disposed to be able to live contentedly without a friend, and as the only friends I have, or am likely to have, are at home, if they were gone, I will not say I could not live, but I would rather not live in such a desolate world.
But why do you say the only friends you are likely to have? Are you so unsociable that you cannot make friends?
No, but I never made one yet, and in my present position there is no possibility of doing so, or even of forming a common acquaintance. The fault may be partly in myself, but I hope not altogether.
The fault is partly in society, and partly, I should think, in your immediate neighbours, and partly too in yourself. For many ladies in your position would make themselves be noticed and accounted of. But your pupils should be companions for you in some degree. They cannot be many years younger than yourself.
Oh yes, they are good company sometimes, but I cannot call them friends, nor would they think of bestowing such a name on me. They have other companions better suited to their tastes.
Perhaps you are too wise for them. How do you amuse yourself when alone? Do you read much?
Reading is my favourite occupation, when I have leisure for it, and books to read. From speaking of books in general, he passed to different books in particular, and proceeded by rapid transitions from topic to topic, till several matters, both of taste and opinion, had been discussed considerably within the space of half an hour, but without the embellishment of many observations from himself, he being evidently less bent upon communicating his own thoughts and predilections than on discovering mine. He had not the tact, or the art, to effect such a purpose by skilfully drawing out my sentiments or ideas through the real or apparent statement of his own, or leading the conversation by imperceptible gradations to such topics as he wished to advert to, but such gentle abruptness and such single-minded straightforwardness could not possibly offend me. And why should he interest himself at all in my moral and intellectual capacities? What is it to him what I think or feel? I asked myself, and my heart throbbed in answer to the question. But Jane and Susan Green soon reached their home. As they stood parleying at the park gates, attempting to persuade Miss Murray to come in, I wished Mr. Weston would go, that she might not see him with me when she turned round; but, unfortunately, his business, which was to pay one more visit to poor Mark Wood, led him to pursue the same path as we did, till nearly the close of our journey. When, however, he saw that Rosalie had taken leave of her friends, and I was about to join her, he would have left me, and passed on at a quicker pace; but, as he civilly lifted his hat in passing her, to my surprise, instead of returning the salute with a stiff, ungracious bow, she accosted him with one of her sweetest smiles, and walking by his side, began to talk to him with all imaginable cheerfulness and affability, and so we proceeded all three together. After a short pause in the conversation, Mr. Weston made some remark addressed particularly to me, as referring to something we had been talking of before, but before I could answer, Miss Murray replied to the observation, and enlarged upon it. He rejoined, and from thence to the close of the interview, she engrossed him entirely to herself. It might be partly owing to my own stupidity, my want of tact and assurance, but I felt myself wronged. I trembled with apprehension, and I listened with envy to her easy, rapid flow of utterance, and saw with anxiety the bright smile with which she looked into his face from time to time, for she was walking a little in advance, for the purpose, as I judged, of being seen as well as heard. If her conversation was light and trivial, it was amusing, and she was never at a loss for something to say, or for suitable words to express it in. There was nothing pert or flippant in her manner now, as when she walked with Mr. Hatfield. There was only a gentle, playful kind of vivacity, which I thought must be peculiarly pleasing to a man of Mr. Weston's disposition and temperament. When he was gone she began to laugh, and muttered to herself,
"I thought I could do it."
"Do what?" I asked.
"Fix that man."
"What in the world do you mean?"
"I mean that he will go home and dream of me. I have shot him through the heart."
"How do you know?"
"By many infallible proofs, more especially the look he gave me when he went away. It was not an impudent look. I exonerate him from that. It was a look of reverential, tender adoration. Ha ha! He's not quite such a stupid blockhead as I thought him."
I made no answer, for my heart was in my throat, or something like it, and I could not trust myself to speak. "Oh God, avert it!" I cried internally. "For his sake, not for mine." Miss Murray made several trivial observations as we passed up the park, to which, in spite of my reluctance to let one glimpse of my feelings appear, I could only answer by monosyllables. Whether she intended to torment me, or merely to amuse herself, I could not tell, and did not much care, but I thought of the poor man and his one lamb, and the rich man with his 1,000 flocks, and I dreaded I knew not what for Mr. Weston, independently of my own blighted hopes. Right glad was I to get into the house, and find myself alone once more in my own room. My first impulse was to sink into the chair beside the bed, and laying my head on the pillow, to seek relief in a passionate burst of tears. There was an imperative craving for such an indulgence, but alas! I must restrain and swallow back my feelings still. There was the bell, the odious bell for the schoolroom dinner, and I must go down with a calm face, and smile, and laugh, and talk nonsense, yes, and eat too, if possible, as if all was right, and I was just returned from a pleasant walk.
End of chapter 15.